In 1939, Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá was executed at the cemetery wall in Guadalajara. Everyone agreed on that. What no one could agree on was where his body ended up, or why his name pointed to a grave that kept lying. His daughter Ascensión was 13 then. She grew old with a black and white photograph folded in cloth, the paper soft from her fingers. "I'll come home," her father had said, buttoning his coat, the pocket notebook pressed flat against his chest. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to wait 78 years for a place to kneel." Somewhere between Timoteo's bullets and Captain Julian Rivas's rubber stamp, a country misplaced a man and called it order. Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá left the house at the same hour every morning, not because the clock told him to, but because routine still felt like protection. The street outside was narrow and smelled faintly of damp stone and coal smoke, the kind of smell that clung to coats long after you stepped inside. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, ran 2 fingers along the seam as if checking it for weakness, and reached instinctively for the small pocket notebook he always carried. It was there. It always was. Inside the notebook were names written in careful, slanted handwriting. Men who worked the fields. Men who argued over wages. Men who trusted Timoteo to remember them accurately. He believed that writing things down made them harder to erase. That belief followed him everywhere. Ascensión watched from the doorway, barefoot on the cold tile, her toes curling slightly against the chill. She was 13 and already practiced at paying attention without seeming to. Her father smiled at her the way he always did in the mornings, quickly, like the smile itself needed to move along. "Listen to your mother," he said, low enough that it felt private. Then, softer still, "Be brave." She nodded. It was easier than speaking. He lifted her once more, just for a moment, the way he used to at gatherings, so she could see over the crowd. The weight of her pressed into his shoulder, familiar, grounding. When he set her down, his hands lingered at her elbows, as if memorizing the shape of her. At the Casa del Pueblo, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of bodies and ink, and yesterday's coffee reheated too many times. Timoteo checked the door when he arrived, the habit of a man who had learned that vigilance could pass for safety. He unfolded his notebook on the table, smoothed the page flat, and read aloud a list of names. Someone misread a slogan painted on the wall, and a brief laugh rippled through the room. It surprised all of them. Even Timoteo laughed, a short sound that ended almost as soon as it began. That was the last moment that felt ordinary. By afternoon, the house smelled of soup and bread. Ascensión helped her mother set the table, counting plates as if the number mattered. Her younger siblings moved around her legs. The window was open just enough to let in air, not enough to let out worry. They ate quickly, listening between bites for footsteps that matched the rhythm they knew. When the knock came, it did not belong to anyone they recognized. It was firm, practiced, not asking permission. Ascensión felt it before she heard it, a tightening in her chest that made her sit up straight. Timoteo stood. He washed his hands slowly at the basin, rubbing them together longer than necessary, as though buying time in seconds. Water dripped onto the floor. He dried his hands carefully, folded the cloth, placed it where it belonged. He checked his notebook once more, slid it into his pocket, and buttoned his coat. "I'll come home," he said. It wasn't a dramatic sentence. It was said the way one promises to return from the market. Outside, the air was sharper. A uniform brushed past Ascensión's shoulder as the men moved her father toward the street. She caught the smell of leather and metal. Timoteo did not look back. That hurt more than if he had. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to watch a father choose steadiness over farewell, but I know that children remember what is withheld as clearly as what is given." The days that followed stretched without shape. Ascensión waited for the sound of his steps, the way some people listen for church bells, trusting repetition more than logic. Each morning, she looked toward the door. Each evening, she tried not to. Her mother folded and refolded the same piece of cloth, smoothing wrinkles that returned as soon as she let go. They were told little. Words arrived, filtered through neighbors, then through fear. Timoteo was being held. There would be a procedure. It would be quick. Asking questions would make it worse. Ascensión learned how to be quiet in a new way, the way that does not invite correction. On the morning of the execution, the sky was pale, the kind of color that suggested restraint. At the cemetery wall, men stood in lines they had not chosen. Captain Julian Rivas, 32, and already tired in a way that sleep could not fix, sharpened a pencil until it squeaked. He preferred a sharp point. It made his handwriting look decisive. He rewrote lists until they appeared clean, names aligned, dates precise. Survival, to him, meant obedience dressed up as order. Paper is the weapon now, a superior had told him once. Rivas believed it. He pressed the rubber seal into the ink, then onto the page. The sound was dull, final. "Just put him in the register," he muttered. "The rest is not our problem." Timoteo stood with others, the wall cold at his back. He thought of his children, of Ascension's weight on his shoulder, of the notebook still warm against his chest. He did not shout. He did not beg. He listened to instructions, because listening had always seemed like a way through. The shots echoed briefly, then fell away. The work continued. What happened afterward mattered as much as what came before. Bodies were handled quickly, without ceremony. Records were made. Numbers replaced names. A decision, careless or deliberate, placed Timoteo in one pit and wrote him into another. The earth accepted him either way. At home, Ascensión waited. She waited through the afternoon, through the evening, through a night that refused to end. When a neighbor finally spoke the words out loud, they did not fit the room. Her mother sat down hard, hands flat on the table, as if the surface could hold her up. They were not given the body. They were not given a place. They were told to move on. Ascensión did not understand how to do that. She folded her father's photograph into cloth the way her mother folded everything else, careful, exact. She touched it before sleep. A ritual she did not yet have words for. The house adjusted around the space he left. His chair remained empty. His coat stayed on its hook longer than it should have. Years passed. Hunger came and went. Fear settled into habits. Ascensión grew taller, then older. She learned which questions were dangerous and which silences were expected. The promise she had heard, "I'll come home," did not fade. It hardened. Sometimes she imagined her father beneath the ground, not as a body, but as a waiting. She did not know where to go to speak to him. There was no marker to touch, no stone to cool her palms in summer. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to carry grief without coordinates, but I can see how a child becomes an old woman still listening for footsteps, still holding a photograph, still believing that writing things down should matter." By the time Ascensión learned to say his name out loud again, decades had passed. The chaos of that first loss had settled into something quieter, heavier. The notebook he carried was gone. The register that claimed him remained, and the lie that order had been kept sat waiting, patient, in the ground. The second violence did not arrive with guns. It arrived with forms. After the execution, the cemetery gates closed the way gates always do on their hinges, without drama. The ground was leveled. The wall returned to being a wall. What remained visible was not grief, but administration. A ledger lay open on a desk somewhere in Guadalajara. Its pages ruled into obedient lines. Ink dried. Dates settled into place. For Ascensión Mendieta, childhood ended without a body to mark the ending. Her mother dressed in black, not for a funeral, but for endurance. In the mornings, Ascensión learned to lower her eyes when uniforms passed. In the evenings, she learned which names could not be spoken. The house filled with rules no one had written down. "Don't ask," a neighbor warned once, voice barely above breath. "It only brings trouble." The trouble was already there. It lived in the gap between what had happened and what could be acknowledged. Captain Julian Rivas continued his work. He sharpened pencils. He drank cheap coffee that burned his tongue and kept him alert. He believed in speed. Files moved across his desk like units of weather, arriving, passing, gone. When he pressed the rubber seal into the paper, it left a clean circle, authoritative and empty at the center. One afternoon, a clerk hesitated over a cemetery entry. The list was long, the stack of bodies longer. Rivas leaned over, tapped the page. "Pit 2, patio 4, he said. "Write it cleanly." "And the position?" the clerk asked. Rivas exhaled. "Second from the bottom, or close enough." Close enough became policy. The ledger that recorded Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá did not lie in a dramatic way. It did something worse. It claimed precision. It gave the family a reference that would later betray them. For decades, that reference was the only permission the state allowed. A line in a book, no grave to tend, no marker to touch. The dead were acknowledged only as entries, their humanity compressed into columns. Ascensión grew up watching adults perform, forgetting as a survival skill. At school, lessons skipped entire years. At church, prayers avoided certain words. In the market, conversations changed direction when unfamiliar ears approached. Fear was not loud. It was routine. At night, Ascensión whispered with her sister Paz, their heads close together, breath warming the space between them. "Do you think he knows where we are?" Paz asked once. Ascensión did not answer right away. She pressed the photograph between her palms, feeling the softening edges. "He knows what is true," she said finally. It was something their father had told them. It felt safer to repeat his words than to invent new ones. As years became decades, Spain changed on the surface. Dictators aged, laws shifted. The language of democracy arrived, cautious and negotiated. When the amnesty law passed, it was presented as reconciliation, as a way forward that required no looking back. For families like the Mendietas, it sounded like a door closing with polite words. When Ascensión went to municipal offices, she dressed carefully, modestly. She carried copies of documents folded and refolded until the creases mapped her persistence. Clerks glanced at the papers, then at her face, then back at the papers. "It's very old," one said, pushing the file away. "There's nothing to be done." Another shrugged. "The records are the records." "But they could be wrong," Ascensión said, her voice steady in the way she had practiced. The clerk did not argue. He simply repeated, "There's nothing to be done." Where, quote, end quote. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to be told, year after year, that the past is settled when it keeps interrupting the present. But I can see how denial becomes another kind of labor placed on survivors, the work of carrying memory alone. Paz grew ill and died without ever seeing her father return to the earth. At the small service they could afford, Ascensión stood beside the grave and felt the imbalance sharply. One sibling had a place, the other did not. "Paz died without seeing even one bone of our father," Ascensión would later say. At the time, she said nothing. She went home and wrapped the photograph again. The cemetery ledger waited. It did not change. It did not correct itself. It sat in a room that smelled of dust and paper, authoritative by default. The state learned to point to it as proof that the matter had been addressed. In offices, Captain Rivas's generation gave way to others. The habits remained. Paperwork moved forward. Responsibility diffused. When asked about graves, officials spoke of logistics, of limitations, of the need not to reopen wounds. The phrase sounded compassionate until you noticed who it protected. "Why now?" someone asked Ascensión once, decades after the shots. "Why dig this up?" She held the photograph tighter. "Because it was never finished," she said. By then, her hands showed their age. The ritual of touching the image before sleep had worn the paper thin. She kept family photos wrapped in cloth, a private archive that did not depend on permission. The cemetery itself changed little. Weather darkened the stone. Weeds found cracks. Somewhere beneath the ground, bodies lay where they had been placed quickly, without names. The ledger insisted they were accounted for. Every so often, rumors surfaced someone had heard of a pit being opened elsewhere, of bones being identified. Hope flickered, then dimmed. Ascensión learned not to trust it too much. Hope, like asking questions, could be dangerous. When a Spanish judge attempted to investigate the broader crimes, the response was swift. Jurisdiction was challenged. Authority was reasserted. The effort stalled. For Ascensión, it felt like watching a door open an inch, then slam shut. She counted the years differently now, not by birthdays or holidays, but by refusals. "I can't pretend I know the weight of carrying a promise for more than 70 years. But I know that promises, when left unresolved, shape the body." Ascensión's posture changed. Her walk slowed. Her voice remained firm. The ledger remained wrong. The system that created it did not need to conspire in secret. It relied on repetition, on clerks who preferred clean lines to messy truths, on citizens taught that stability required restraint, on the idea that time itself would finish the work. It did not. By the time Ascensión reached her 80s, the photograph had become almost translucent at the edges. The question of where her father lay was no longer just personal. It had become an indictment of how a country managed its dead. Pit 2, the record said. The ground did not agree. And somewhere between the two, a daughter continued to age, still without a place to stand, still holding proof that a man had lived and had been deliberately misplaced. Ascensión Mendieta learned early that doors in Spain did not slam. They closed politely, with reasons attached: budget, jurisdiction, procedure. Each explanation arrived neatly packaged, as if care had been taken to soften the refusal. By the time she reached her late 80s, she could recite the language herself. She knew which offices required appointments and which required patience. She knew the smell of municipal corridors, paper, disinfectant, old radiators warming too slowly in winter. Every visit followed the same rhythm. She would unfold her documents, smoothing them flat with the side of her hand, the cemetery registry page, copied and recopied, the execution date, the name written as it had always been written. Clerks would scan, nod, and return the papers across the counter. "It's very complicated," one said, already turning to the next file. Ascensión gathered the pages without protest. She had learned that visible anger shortened conversations. Outside, she paused to catch her breath, resting one hand on the stone wall. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to keep standing up after being told, again, that the past is not available. But I can see how endurance becomes a kind of expertise." At home, she counted days the way others count pills. She marked dates on a calendar even when nothing was scheduled, a habit left over from caring for others. Her hope had narrowed over time. It no longer asked for justice or acknowledgement. It asked for one thing: a place to bury her father properly. When a Spanish judge attempted to investigate crimes like her father's, Ascensión paid attention. For the first time in years, the conversation shifted. Words like investigation and responsibility appeared in newspapers. She followed the case closely, cutting out articles, folding them into her cloth-wrapped archive. Then, just as quickly, it ended. The judge was removed. The effort declared overreaching. The door closed again. For Ascensión, the refusal landed differently this time. It did not surprise her. It clarified something. The answer was not coming from inside the country that held her father's body. If the system would not move, she would have to step outside it. The idea of traveling to Argentina did not arrive fully formed. It came through whispers, through other families, through activists who spoke carefully but with urgency. There was a case there, they said. A judge who believed borders did not excuse crimes. A possibility, fragile but real. Buenos Aires might as well have been another planet. Ascensión had never flown before. At 88, the thought of crossing an ocean felt unreasonable, almost embarrassing. Her body had its limits. Her energy arrived in measured doses. Still, the calendar filled. "I don't have much time," she said to a lawyer helping coordinate the trip. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact. On the day she left, she packed lightly. A change of clothes, her documents, the photograph, wrapped carefully as always. At the airport, the hum of voices and rolling suitcases made her grip the strap of her bag tighter. She watched planes taxi past the windows, enormous and indifferent. During the flight, she did not sleep. She pressed the photograph flat against the tray table, tracing the outline of her father's face with one finger. The edges of the paper caught slightly on her skin. She whispered his name once, testing how it sounded at 30,000 feet. In Buenos Aires, Judge Maria Cervini received her not as a curiosity, but as a witness. Cervini's office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Files were stacked high, each representing a story that had refused to stay buried. The judge read slowly, underlining verbs, as was her habit took: shot, hid. She believed actions mattered more than justifications. Ascensión sat across from her, hands folded in her lap. She spoke without notes. The years had organized her memory with ruthless efficiency. Dates, refusals, the weight of not knowing where to go. When she finished, there was a brief pause. "If your courts won't act," Cervini said, looking directly at her, "mine will ask them to." It was not a promise of success. It was a promise of insistence. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to hear a door open after so many years of careful closure." But I know how posture changes when someone is finally addressed as if their time matters. The legal mechanism was technical, almost inelegant. Exhorto's formal requests would be sent. Spain would be asked to cooperate. The language would be precise, the tone firm. For Ascensión, the details blurred. What mattered was that something was moving. Back in Spain, the news traveled unevenly. Some newspapers treated the case as an oddity. Others ignored it. For the families who had been waiting, it sounded like permission. Calls began to circulate. Names were exchanged. The past stirred. René Pacheco, an archaeologist with the Association for the Recovery of Historical Memory, heard about Ascensión through those channels. He had spent years working between field sites and archives, trusting photographs more than institutions. When they met, Ascensión studied his hand strong, careful, permanently marked by dirt that never fully washed away. "The earth will tell us," he said, not unkindly. "The paperwork won't." She nodded. She had learned that lesson long ago. The process was slow. Exhortos crossed borders. Responses lagged. Permissions arrived, wrapped in neutral language, careful to avoid admitting responsibility. For Ascensión, each delay carried weight. She felt time differently now, not as a series of years, but as a narrowing corridor. At night, she reread the same letters, as if repetition might make them settle into reality. She touched the photograph before sleep, the ritual unchanged. Sometimes, she dreamed of standing in a cemetery without knowing where to go. Other times, she dreamed of her father's notebook, pages fluttering open in the wind. The decision to proceed with an excavation had not yet been made. Nothing had been touched. Still, the case had shifted. It was no longer private grief. It had become a legal question that required answers. That transformation carried its own pressure. What if they open the grave and he isn't there? A journalist asked her once, leaning forward expectantly. Ascensión did not hesitate. "Then we keep looking," she said, "because that would mean they lied. I can't pretend. I know the courage it takes to risk disappointment at that age. But I can see how refusal, practiced over decades, becomes a muscle." Judge Cervini continued to insist. She sent additional requests. She cited international obligations. She framed the issue not as history, but as ongoing harm. The language mattered. It turned memory into mandate. In Spain, officials complied carefully. They referred to technical cooperation. They avoided broader implications. The machinery moved just enough to function. For Ascensión, the wait resumed. But it felt different now. There was direction. There were names attached to actions. When she spoke to René Pacheco on the phone, she listened to the sounds behind his voice, the scrape of chairs, the echo of offices, the shuffle of documents. "We're preparing," he said once. "It's not immediate." "I understand," she replied. She always did. Time pressed closer. Her body reminded her daily of its limits. Still, she dressed neatly for every meeting, as if respect were armor. When she was addressed as Señora, rather than as a problem, it felt like a small victory. The discovery in this phase was not a bone or a grave. It was leverage. It was the realization that a single refusal, carried far enough, could change the direction of a case. Ascensión had moved the question of her father's body out of the realm of personal sorrow and into the arena of law. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to turn grief into motion so late in life. But I know that when she returned from Argentina, she carried herself differently. The photograph remained in her bag. The promise remained unfinished. But the ground, somewhere, had begun to feel reachable. The risk ahead was clear. If the grave were opened and empty, the lie would deepen. If nothing were found, the waiting would have to continue. Ascensión accepted that risk without hesitation. "I didn't come this far to stop," she said quietly, as if speaking to her father more than to anyone else. The case moved forward, not because Spain had changed its mind, but because a woman refused to die without proof. The first excavation began with order. On a cold morning, in January 2016, the cemetery in Guadalajara opened to a different kind of routine. Metal fencing went up. Tools were laid out with care. Clipboards appeared. The ground was marked according to the registry: Pit 2, Patio 4. The paperwork was clear. For decades, it had been the only thing that was. René Pacheco stood at the edge of the site, trowel in hand, the handle wrapped in tape worn smooth by years of use. He photographed the surface before anyone touched it. He always did. Layers mattered. Context mattered. He trusted images because they did not forget what they saw. Ascensión Mendieta arrived, bundled against the cold, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. The cemetery air smelled of damp earth and old stone. She stood upright, hands clasped, her black and white photograph tucked safely in her bag. She did not step forward. She did not look away. "This is where they say he is," someone murmured nearby. René nodded, but his eyes stayed on the ground. "This is where the book says," he replied. The digging began slowly. Each layer was removed with deliberate patience. Soil gave way to fragments, buttons, bits of fabric, bone. Every discovery was documented, photographed, numbered. The team worked in silence, broken only by instructions and the scrape of metal against earth. Each body was treated as someone's father, someone's brother, someone's unfinished story. As they descended, the structure of the pit became clear. Bodies had been stacked quickly, carelessly, one atop another. The smell of disturbed soil grew stronger. Gloves brushed against fabric that had not seen air in decades. The past asserted itself physically. Ascensión watched from a short distance, her feet planted firmly. She did not cry. She did not speak. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to stand over a pit that might hold your father after nearly 80 years. But I know how stillness can be a form of control." Days passed. Samples were taken. Numbers accumulated. The team reached the position described in the registry second from the bottom, or close enough. René paused, checking notes, cross-referencing photographs. "This should be him," someone said quietly. The samples were sent for DNA analysis. The waiting began again, compressed now into weeks instead of decades, but no less heavy. Ascensión returned home, counting days like doses, touching the photograph before sleep. When the results arrived in December, the message was brief. Negative. Timoteo Mendieta was not in Pit 2. The shock was immediate and sharp. It was not simply that the search had failed. It was that the record, the one thing the state had offered as truth, had been wrong. Ascensión closed her eyes when René told her. Her hand tightened around the edge of the table. For a moment, the room felt too small. "So where is he?" she asked. René did not answer right away. He chose his words carefully. "If he's not where they wrote," he said, "then the writing itself is the problem. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to have hope dismantled by evidence. But I know how devastating it is to realize that the system did not just abandon you, it misled you." The failure forced a recalibration. The team returned to the archives, scrutinizing cemetery books with new suspicion. Patterns emerged. Names listed in one pit appeared in another. Dates blurred. Positions contradicted physical reality. The conclusion was unavoidable. Timoteo had been buried in one pit and recorded in another. Whether the error was carelessness or deliberate cruelty no longer mattered. Its effect was the same. It sent families searching in the wrong ground for generations. René called Ascensión again. "We can stop," he said honestly. "Or, we can expand the search." She did not hesitate. "We keep digging," she said. It was not a demand. It was a statement of survival. Judge Maria Servini issued a new exhorto. Another request. Another insistence. The language was firm, unyielding. Spain's courts authorized a second excavation, this time broader, less trusting of the books. In May 2017, the team returned to the cemetery. This time, they opened Pit 1 and the surrounding area. The work stretched over more than 3 weeks. The sun beat down during the day, drying sweat into salt on their skin. Dust clung to clothing. Fingernails never quite came clean. René photographed everything. Each layer, each bone, each fragment of cloth that hinted at a life interrupted. The trowel moved carefully, methodically. There was no room for haste now. Ascensión visited when she could. Standing over the site, she looked smaller somehow, but steadier. She spoke to René softly. "Paz should be here," she said once, almost to herself. René nodded. He understood the weight of who was missing from the moment. Bodies continued to emerge. More than expected. Each one demanded attention, documentation, respect. The count grew. Other families began to wait alongside Ascensión, each watching the ground for signs that might belong to them. The pressure was immense. René carried a particular fear, finding the wrong person, giving certainty where it did not belong. Breaking a family twice, he called it. He double-checked everything: photographs, labels, samples. On June 9th, the call came from the laboratory. A match. DNA confirmation from lab genetics identified Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá among the remains recovered in the second excavation. The words landed quietly, but their weight was enormous. René sat down when he heard. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash through him. Then he picked up the phone. "We found him," he said. Ascensión did not speak at first. Her breath caught. She pressed the photograph flat against her chest, the paper warm now from her body. "Thank you," she whispered finally. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to have proof arrive after nearly 80 years. But I know that certainty, when it finally comes, does not shout, it settles." The consequences extended beyond one family. Across both excavations, 54 bodies were recovered. Through the process of searching for Timoteo, 27 families would eventually receive identifications. One refusal had opened a crowded ground. The cemetery logs, once treated as authoritative, were now exposed as unreliable witnesses. The earth had contradicted the ink. Who decided to scramble the records? Who benefited from confusion that lasted generations? Those questions lingered, unresolved. What was undeniable was the pattern. Mislabeling was not an exception. For Ascensión, the race against time had ended just in time. Her body bore the marks of waiting, slower steps, careful movements, but her promise had survived her lifespan. Standing near the pit where her father had been found, she touched the ground lightly with her fingertips. It was cool, solid, real. "He's here," she said. Not as a question, as an end to searching. The forensic work continued around her. Notes were taken, boxes labeled. The machinery of identification moved forward, but something fundamental had shifted. The early assumption that the records would lead them had collapsed under evidence. In its place stood a harder truth. The ground knew more than the state ever admitted. And for the first time since 1939, Timoteo Mendieta was no longer misplaced. The return of Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in a box. The container was plain, utilitarian, designed for transport rather than reverence. Inside were bones cleaned by careful hands, catalogued and verified, each piece restored to its proper place after decades of disorder. When Ascensión Mendieta was told she could see him, she dressed as she always had for important moments, neatly, deliberately, as if respect itself might steady her. The room where she was brought smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. René Pacheco stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, giving her space without leaving her alone. Ascensión approached slowly. Her steps were measured, her breath shallow. She placed the photograph on the table first. The cloth unfolded with the same care she had practiced since childhood. The image of her father, younger than she had ever been allowed to know him, rested beside what remained of his body. "So this is you," she said softly. It was not a dramatic sentence. It was recognition. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to meet a parent for the first time through bone, but I can see how the body remembers who it belongs to." Ascensión reached out, stopped herself, then rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the present. For days afterward, the world seemed to move around her at an unfamiliar pace. Interviews were requested, statements drafted, schedules proposed. The story had become public, and with that visibility came expectation. "You must be so relieved," a reporter said, leaning forward, pen poised. Ascensión considered the word. "I can sleep," she replied. "That's enough." The funeral was set for early July 2017 at the civil cemetery of La Almudena in Madrid. The choice of location was deliberate. This was a place where those denied religious burial, those cast aside by official memory, had found rest. It felt right. On the morning of the service, the sky was clear, the heat already rising from the stone paths. Ascensión arrived early. She wore black, not as a symbol, but as habit. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her bag. Inside, the photograph was there, as always. The coffin was modest, no excess. No attempt to soften the truth of what it represented. As it was carried into place, a murmur passed through the crowd. Nearly 2,000 people had gathered, union members, activists, families who recognized themselves in her waiting. Red flags appeared, folded respectfully. Faces were solemn, attentive. Ascensión stood close, her posture straight. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward without assistance. "I feel very happy," she said, her voice steady despite the heat. "I will sleep peacefully now. We did it." The words were simple. They landed heavily. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to finish mourning after 78 years. But I know how rare it is to hear relief without triumph, gratitude without celebration." As the coffin was lowered, Ascensión reached out and placed the photograph on top for a moment before it disappeared from view. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze. She retrieved it quickly, pressing it back into her bag, as if not yet ready to let it rest. Around her, people watched quietly. Some cried. Others stood with fists clenched at their sides. For many, this was not just Timoteo's burial. It was a rehearsal for a future they still hoped to claim. René stood off to the side, observing. The sound of a name spoken with certainty still echoed in him. For years, he had worked with remains that rarely resolved so cleanly. Watching Ascensión now, he felt the weight of what had been returned and of what still waited. "This is why we keep going," he murmured to a colleague. The documentary cameras were present, unobtrusive, but persistent. The filmmakers had followed Ascensión through courtrooms, airports, cemetery gates. Their lens captured her face. As the coffin descended, the way her shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if a long-held tension had finally released. Later, when asked about becoming a symbol, Ascensión frowned. "I didn't want this," she said. "I wanted my father." The truth of that statement cut through the narratives forming around her. She had not sought visibility. Visibility had followed her insistence. In the days after the funeral, letters arrived. Some were from strangers thanking her. Others were from families, asking how she had done it. What steps to take, who to call. Ascensión read them slowly, resting between pages. She answered when she could. Sometimes she simply held the envelope and closed her eyes, imagining the hands that had written it. At home, her routines shifted subtly. The photograph remained, but it no longer felt like a substitute. It became what it had always wanted to be, a memory, not a stand-in. She still touched it before sleep, but the gesture softened, lost some of its urgency. "I kept my promise," she said to René once, over the phone. "Now I don't know what to do with my days." René did not rush to fill the silence that followed. He understood that endings could feel as disorienting as beginnings. The story continued to spread. The film El Silencio de Otros brought Ascensión's journey to audiences far beyond Spain. Viewers watched her sit patiently in courtrooms, stand unflinching beside open pits, cross an ocean for one grave. For many, it was the first time the consequences of misfiled death felt personal. Public discussions followed. Panels, debates. Politicians spoke cautiously. The phrase historical memory gained traction, though often stripped of its human core. Ascensión watched some of the coverage on television, the volume low. When her image appeared on screen, she looked away. "They talk so much now," she said to a neighbor. "Before, they told us not to speak at all. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to see your private grief become public property. But I know how easily stories flatten the people inside them." For Ascensión, the victory was specific and contained. Her father had a grave. She knew where to go. She visited once, then again, then less often. She did not linger. The place existed. That was enough. Timoteo Mendieta was no longer an anonymous entry or a misdirected reference. His name appeared on a marker. Dates aligned with reality. The lie had been corrected, at least in one place. But the correction did not erase what had been done. It did not restore lost years or return pause to witness the end. It did not undo the hunger, the fear, the careful silences. What it did was allow one woman to finish a sentence she had been carrying since childhood. At night, Ascensión slept more deeply. She dreamed less of searching. Sometimes she dreamed of her father as he had been lifting her, laughing briefly, checking his notebook before leaving. When she woke, the house felt quieter, not emptier. The human truth of the case was not that justice had prevailed. It was that grief, when denied, does not fade. It waits. And when finally acknowledged, it changes shape. I can't pretend I know what peace feels like after such a long delay. But I know it rarely looks like celebration. More often, it looks like an old woman sitting down without the weight she has always carried and realizing, for the first time, that she can rest. Ascensión Mendieta died in September 2019, 2 years after her father was buried. The news did not arrive loudly. It moved through small articles, short announcements, a statement from the Union. 94 years old. Promise kept. For those who had followed her journey closely, the timing mattered. She did not die waiting. She died knowing where her father was. In the weeks after, her apartment was quieter than before, but not empty. The photograph of Timoteo Mendieta still sat wrapped in cloth, though no one touched it now. A neighbor came by to water the plants. A niece sorted papers slowly, unsure what to keep. The calendar Ascensión used to mark court dates and letters remained on the wall, the last square unfilled. At the cemetery, Timoteo's grave received visitors Ascensión would never meet. Other families stood there, reading the name, tracing the letters with their fingers, imagining their own dead in the same ground. Some left flowers. Others simply stood, absorbing the fact that a wrong grave had once been corrected. René Pacheco returned to Guadalajara more than once after the Mendieta case closed. The work did not end with one identification. It accelerated. Families arrived with copies of ledgers, with faded photographs, with questions shaped by decades of restraint. "We're here because of her," one man told him, holding a folder against his chest. René nodded. He had heard it before. He felt it every time he opened a pit that should never have been hidden. The earth there was crowded. 54 bodies had come out during the search for one man. Each one required care. Each one demanded accuracy. At night, René scrubbed dirt from under his fingernails that never fully disappeared. It was a small thing, but it followed him home. A reminder that the work stayed in the body. Judge Maria Servini's case file did not close when Timoteo was identified. It expanded. New exhortos were drafted, new names added. The folder grew thicker, heavier. At her desk, she continued to read testimonies slowly, underlining verbs. "Took," she murmured once, tapping the page. "Hid." Her fear remained practical. Witnesses aged, memory thinned, time pressed from both sides. She knew that cooperation from Spain remained partial, careful, technical. Permission to dig did not equal admission of wrongdoing. Inside Spain, the legal conflict persisted. Courts complied without acknowledging the crime. Excavations were allowed under administrative language, stripped of accountability. The ground could be opened, but the past could not be prosecuted. For many families, that distinction mattered less than it should have. What they wanted was not punishment. It was location. A place to stand. Proof that their waiting had not been foolish. At an ARMH meeting, months after Ascension's death, a woman in her 70s stood and spoke softly. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want to know which hole he's in." The room was still. The request was not abstract. It was logistical. Human. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to inherit a search from someone who ran out of time. But I can see how urgency shifts when the last children of the executed begin to disappear. In Guadalajara, the cemetery logs remained unchanged. They still pointed to Pit 2. Patio 4. The ink did not correct itself. The truth existed outside the books now, in photographs, DNA reports, and memories carried by the living. Some officials spoke of moving forward. Others warned against reopening wounds. René heard those phrases often enough that they lost meaning. Wounds, he knew, do not reopen. They remain. The Mendieta case became precedent, not because it was unique, but because it was ordinary. A man executed, a body misplaced, a family denied the right to ask. The only difference was that one daughter refused to stop. ARH continued its work, stretched thin. Volunteers rotated through sites, carrying tools and notebooks, learning how to listen to soil. Funding remained uncertain. The need did not. Sometimes, René thought of Ascensión standing at the edge of the pit during the first excavation, waiting for a result that would break her either way. He remembered how she had straightened her coat before each visit, how she never stepped too close unless invited. She trusted us, he said once, quietly. That's the part I don't forget. In Madrid, Timoteo's grave settled into the landscape of La Almudena. Weather touched the stone. Leaves gathered at its base. The marker did its simple job. It named someone. Visitors sometimes read it aloud, as if testing the sound. Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá. A young man whispered once, standing there alone. That sound name attached to place was what Ascensión had waited for. The victory, if it could be called that, was incomplete by design. One grave corrected did not balance thousands mislabeled. One family reunited did not compensate for a system that relied on forgetting as stability. But the case altered expectations. Families began to ask different questions. Activists spoke with more certainty. Judges abroad took note. The ground itself became evidence, not just backdrop. I can't pretend I know what justice looks like when time has already done its damage. But I know that the absence of accountability does not erase the presence of proof. What remains is practical. Ledgers that cannot be trusted. Graves that need opening. Names waiting to be spoken with certainty. And the knowledge that truth, once found, refuses to stay contained. On a quiet afternoon, a volunteer closed a gate at the Guadalajara cemetery after another day of work. The metal clicked into place. The earth lay disturbed, then smoothed again, holding what it still held. Somewhere in that ground, many more were still misplaced. And somewhere else, in a small apartment now emptied of its keeper, a promise no longer needed to be carried. It had been delivered. A grave marker now carries the name Timoteo Mendieta Alcalá. The letters are evenly spaced, cut deep enough to last. Anyone can stand there. Anyone can read it aloud. That alone would have been unthinkable for most of Ascensión Mendieta's life. She lived from 13 to 91 without that certainty. From a girl waiting for footsteps, to an old woman crossing an ocean with a photograph worn thin by touch. When she finally stood beside her father's grave, it did not correct the past. It corrected a lie. "I'll come home," he had said. He did through her. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to outlive injustice long enough to outwait it. But I know that waiting changes the shape of a person. It narrows hope. It sharpens purpose. It turns memory into labor. Spain still argues about how to name its dead. Files remain sealed. Ledgers remain wrong. Cooperation continues without confession. The ground holds more answers than the state is willing to ask for. What lingers after this story is not closure. It is imbalance. One father returned to his family. Thousands still listed, mislisted, or never listed at all. The grave that lied was not an exception. It was a template. Ascensión Mendieta is gone now. The last witness to her own childhood loss. But the proof she forced into daylight remains bone, name, place. And somewhere, in another town, another daughter still holds a photograph, still listens for permission, still believes that writing things down should matter. The question is no longer whether the graves exist. It's who will arrive in time to open them.